racial and ethnic groups tip or get tipped? What can you tell us about race of the tipper? So there's, waiters talk about that certain racial and ethnic groups, and I should say national groups, always tip, worse than others. What do you know about that?
Blacks tip less than whites in this country. They're more likely to leave without tipping at all. If they do leave a tip, it's on average a smaller amount. They're more likely to be flat tippers and not tip a percentage of the bill. It's partially a little bit mediated by socioeconomic status. That is, blacks also have lower educations and incomes in this country than whites, and people with higher incomes and educations tend to tip more. So that's part of the reason that blacks tip less, but it's only a tiny part.
What's the other part? What do you know about why that is then?
I can tell you it's not exclusively an issue of service discrimination, because I find even controlling for the customer's perceptions of service quality, blacks tip less than whites. The most powerful explanation is that it is a difference in perceived injunctive and descriptive tipping norms.
Ooh, I didn't understand that.
All right. An injunctive norm is a norm about what you should do.
Okay.
And a descriptive norm is a norm that describes what people do.
I see.
Okay? What I found is that blacks in this country, only about a third of them, if you ask, how much are you expected to tip in a restaurant context, only about a third of blacks will say, give an answer in the 15 to 20% range.
I see. And that compares how to whites?
2/3 of whites.
Interesting. It makes sense that social norms vary from group to group, right? So
yes.
I guess it's not so surprising in some way.
That's right. It's not completely surprising. But what's surprising to me is knowledge of the injunctive norm explains only about a third of the black-white difference in tipping. When I include differences in descriptive norms, because I could know, oh yeah, you're supposed to tip 15%, but nobody really does that, right?
Yeah.
That would be being aware of the injunctive norm, but having a different perception of what the descriptive norm is. And it turns out that there's also a black-white difference in perceptions of what people do. If I take both of those perceptions of the injunctive and descriptive norms, I can account for about half of the black-white difference in tipping.
Wow.
What's beyond that? I'm stumped. I mean, I've tested everything I can think of. If any of the listeners have ideas, have them email me, because I'm looking for areas to do, to test next.
All right, that's fascinating. So first of all, what is your email?
wml3@cornell.edu.
Call me Jackrabbit. I am an exotic dancer.
My name is Yvette Morgan, and actually I'm a host at a restaurant.
Basically because, not speaking for all blacks, but we have a mindset of the fact that whatever we're doing for that service, we're getting paid. So a tip is basically a gratuity, which is an extra. And then I guess in other cultures, they see it as a form of income. I know, for example, when I talk to some people that I know that are white, when it comes to restaurant tipping, they always presume the fact that, well, they don't make any money, so the tip is on the counter. So they view it different.
It's your attitude. I'm not saying that black people have bad attitudes, but if you don't, you can make the tips if you have a good attitude. I don't care if you're black, white, or whatever. If you have a bad attitude, you're not going to make good tips.
What about differences in tipping for black customers toward black versus white servers?
Both groups, blacks and whites, will tip a white server more than a black server. And that's even controlling for perceptions of service.
So a black customer will tip a black server less than a black customer will tip a white server.
Yes.
All else being equal.
Yes.
So it's fascinating. What can you tell us about other racial or ethnic groups, Asians, Latinos, immigrants versus, on and on? I'll
Sure.
take whatever you have. It's fascinating.
The data on other ethnic groups is more mixed. There are several studies finding that Hispanics tip less than whites, but there are studies showing no Hispanic-white difference in tipping. I haven't yet teased apart what's going on. Why am I getting it sometimes and not others? And the same thing is true with Asians. I do have some studies showing that Asians tip less than whites, other studies showing that they do not. The one thing I can say for certain is that the Asian-white difference, even when it does exist, is very fragile. That is, I can control for things like sex, education, income, and it disappears. The Hispanic white, when it exists, is often robust. I can control for education, income, and it's still there. But I don't find it as consistently as I find the black white difference.
With all groups, once you control for income, if you can, men versus women as customers, who tips more?
In general, there's no sex difference.
Is that right?
Yeah. And even the sex of server, sex of customer interaction we talked about previously, it has been observed consistently enough for me to say it's a real effect, but it's not universal. You don't always find that up in the
I see. What about the age of the customer?
Older customers tend to tip less. They're also more willing, they base their tips on service quality a little bit more than younger people.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you obviously know so much about this strange but common practice of tipping. If you could rewrite the custom, rewrite the social mores, which is obviously impossible because it arrives over a lot of time with a lot of people participating in it, what would you do? How would you make tipping more either sensible or directly related to the things it should be related to, and so on?
You know, I think I would outlaw it.
You would.
Yeah. And it might be illegal as it is because of the race of server effect that we had previously discussed. It's conceivable. You can make the argument that tipping is a condition of employment that has an adverse impact on a protected class.
So it's discriminatory.
It's discriminatory. And the Supreme Court has ruled that even neutral business practices that are not intended to discriminate, if they have the effect of adversely impacting a protected class, are illegal. And so it's not inconceivable to me that there will be a class action lawsuit on the part of ethnic minority waiters and waitresses claiming discrimination in terms of employment. And it's conceivable that tipping might be declared illegal on that basis.
You're talking theoretically, or is this a movement that actually exists?
Oh, I know of no such lawsuit in existence, but I've talked to.
Not hard
I've
for you
also
to imagine.
It's not hard for me to imagine. I've talked to lawyers, including people who specialize in labor and employment law, and I've gotten mixed opinions. I mean, some of those lawyers have said, no, the courts would never go there. Others go, no, that is a reasonable theory of the law. That's plausible.
I think it is plausible. My firm would take a good hard look at a case if a server came to us and made that complaint.
Justin Swartz is a lawyer at Outman Grove in New York City. He represents employees in class action discrimination cases. He's sued some of the biggest restaurants in New York for shorting employees on the tips they deserved. If his firm were to take on a discrimination case like Michael Lynn has proposed, Swartz would pursue two lines of argument.
First would be disparate impact analysis. The purpose of disparate impact analysis is to eliminate what the Supreme Court calls headwinds, policies that make it harder for racial minorities or other people in other protected classes to succeed.
With disparate impact, you don't have to prove that discrimination is intentional. It's a proxy for discrimination.
The idea is that if there's a disproportionate impact on a particular group, here would be African American or non-white servers, then the plaintiffs have made the first showing they need to make with their case.
And the second argument?
The second step then is the employer's burden.
Meaning, it's up to the employer to prove that tipping is a business necessity, not a custom, but a necessity. Let's say I'm a restaurateur and I come to you and I say, look, I know what you do, I know who you represent, and I want to avoid unfairness, and I also want my business to prosper. So let's say I calculate the average tips in my restaurant, and it's 20%. And I hate the fact that wait staff member A earns 50% more than waitstaff worker Z, because waitstaff worker A happens to have these attributes that for whatever reason get a lot of tips. Pooling is complicated for whatever reason. Let's just say I don't want to deal with all that complication, so I'm just going to say on my menu to my clientele, we're getting rid of tipping because it's inefficient, sloppy, and potentially discriminatory. Average tips here were about 20%, and therefore we're just going to ban tipping and instead raise our prices 20%.
I don't see any problem with that from a labor law perspective. And in fact, that might be the best way for restaurants to insulate themselves from liability.
Now, you may know that some restaurants in the U.S. have already eliminated tipping. They use an automatic service charge instead. If customers want to, they can tip on top of that service charge. One restaurant in San Diego, called the Lincoln, has gone so far as to ban tipping. If you leave extra money on top of the Linkery's 18% service charge, that money will be given to charity. Jay Porter owns the Linkery. He thinks tipping is absolutely ridiculous.
If tipping had never been invented and you were starting your restaurant, would you use tipping as the way to compensate your best employees, your most important employees, all your employees? Would that be the system that you would pick in a vacuum to compensate your team? And I think the answer is clearly no, because it's a stupid system. so why not do it the right way, even if it's a little scary?
Live or travel outside the United States, this entire discussion of leaving a tip in a restaurant might seem ridiculous. Much of the world operates on the simple premise of a service charge or a fixed price, no tip expected. The U.S. is empirically tip crazy.
In the U.S., we have 31 different service professions being tipped.
That's Magnus Torfason.
In Canada, we have 26 or 27, which is the same as in India. In the Netherlands, we have 15. Then we have in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, we have between 5 and 10.
Torfason teaches entrepreneurship at the Harvard Business School.
In Japan, we have 4. And in Iceland, we have 0.
Guess where Torfason is from? Yes, Iceland.
So that's on the exact opposite end of the spectrum from the US, which is a country where tipping is most prevalent.
Now, why was he comparing tipping in countries around the world? What does this research show? Well, if you're looking for yet another reason to hate tipping, listen to this.
The more tipping you see in a given country, the more corruption you generally see in that country as well.
Here's how we came to that conclusion.
So we started by collecting information about tipping in some 33 different countries and in 33 different service professions. These are waiters, hairdressers, taxi drivers, and so on. And we also looked at the levels of corruption in these countries, looking at how they scored on the Corruption Perception Index, which is publicized by Transparency International. Running a simple correlation, we found that there is a positive relationship between those two, which could have been for many different reasons. But we then controlled for a number of other factors, such as GDP, the culture in the country in general, homicide rates, and other measures of legal enforcement. And this relationship stayed significant. We found that even after controlling for these other things, we still find this positive relationship between tipping and corruption.
Why in the world would this be? Was Torfason surprised?
Well, so I was not as surprised as many others. I started this research because I had an inkling that there was this dark side of tipping. In the US, we have a strong norm for tipping. And so if you're a upstanding and law-abiding citizen, you're very likely to be also a good tipper because that's what the norms tell you, and you're also likely to avoid corruption. But across countries, we see a different pattern where these norms that encourage tipping, which is a form of informal payment for services, may be leaking over into other forms of exchange which are not as positive and not as socially beneficial as tipping.
So in the end, Steve Levitt is right to dislike tipping, isn't he? Even if he's not right for all the right reasons.
I don't like to tip. Tipping's unpleasant.
As I said earlier, it's not that Levitt is ungenerous. It's just that tipping is too woolly, too random, too confusing.
Well, I tip caddies. So when I play golf, I'm extremely generous with caddies.
Mm-hmm. See, I think my tipping is rubbed off on you, frankly. Because when we met, you wouldn't tip anybody. You would barely tip at a restaurant.
Well, I didn't like to talk to people, so I just let you do the tipping because that was easier. But you have a different strategy than me. Every time you get into a car that takes you from some place to another, as we often do when we're on the road, you tip the guy, which I think is a terrible equilibrium. So I am in a different equilibrium where for the entire year, I do not tip anyone, ever. No mention of it. And then what I've taken to doing now is there's a car service I use a lot to get to the airport. And so what I did is instead of ever tipping, I just sent a bunch of cash to this car service. And I said, well, you just give it to the drivers according to what you think would be fair.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure that was distributed equally, right?
I don't know what equally, but I will say the reaction of the drivers.
Okay, let me rephrase. I'm sure that was distributed at all. And
I thought
cash comes to like the guy. One person at a car company gets. That's how you tip.